Hey, welcome to another CDK releases video. My name is Matthew Bonig. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 2.28.0 and a minor point release 2.28.1. So let's get right into it. First up is in the EC2 module, we get a change to the VPC construct where you can now provide an additional availability zones property, which will let you define exactly which availability zones that VPC releases into. So if you want to skip, say, US East 1A and just go to B, C, and D, you can specify that now directly as a value. This value is exclusive to the max AZs options, so you provide one or the other. So if you only want two availability zones and you want a B and C, you provide that property. If you want it into just three, then you just go back to using the max AZs property. The CFN spec gets updated to 75.0 unless you're working with L1 constructs. Probably won't matter to you a whole lot. CloudWatch gets a new add widget method to the widget container classes. So when you're building out CloudWatch dashboards, you have these container classes called row and column that allow you to lay out how that dashboard looks. And those row and column classes now have this add widget method onto it for adding in these widgets after you've initially created the construct. So a little bit of a quality of life change there. Code build gets a report group type property. This is a pass through to the underlying L1, but if you are running a code build project that produces both test reports as well as code coverage reports, you can now separate those things out a little bit more. Core gets an update for allowing you to pass in the Docker build target. So if you're running on a Mac M1 processor, which is an ARM-based processor, you now have this option to specify that you want it still building on an x86 build target for all of your assets. It can be very useful if you are building locally and deploying out to an AWS environment. EC2 now gets the ability to use the Graviton 3 processor instance types. So if you want to run on those latest and greatest Graviton processors, you now have that instance type set up in there and you don't have to use escape hatches anymore. ECS adds an external network mode for the external task definition and task definition. So if you're using ECS anywhere, that's going to be a good value. ECS patterns gets exec support. So let's dig into this one a little bit more. So in this change, we get to see that there's now this enable execute command equals true, which allows us to turn on that ability to remote execute commands against our ECS containers, regardless if they're EC2 backed or Fargate backed. And this can be really useful if you want to log in and debug a running container. And there's some documents here that they reference right here in the README for how to go and actually run those commands and execute them. So very useful if you're going to be trying to do some debugging. I actually ran into this problem recently where we had a container that was failing and we couldn't really tell exactly why it was. So this would have been a really useful feature to have to turn on and use there. In the Lambda module, they are updating all of the internal Lambda functions from Node 10 and Node 12 up to Node 14. This is to avoid any of the deprecation notices that are coming from AWS in the future about those being deprecated runtimes, hopefully eliminating a lot of those email blasts that we kind of tend to see when things like the Python 3.6 Lambda runtime went deprecated. And finally, on the OpenSearch service, we have this option so that when the domain has the enforce HTTPS set to true, and we want to enforce that on there, it's going to set all the default ports on the connections to 443 so that there aren't any kind of confusions about security groups and other things like that. Moving on to bug fixes. In the core, there is a fix around the property overrides, sometimes not working with intrinsics. So if you are building L2 constructs that are using a lot of L1s and you're having to use overrides and intrinsic functions and all these other things, there were some issues in the past about combining those things and overrides sometimes not working. So this fixes up a lot of those issues around there. Again, if you're just using L2s and L3s, this is probably not a feature or a fix that you're too worried about. They also updated and added a new feature flag in around the removal policy.snapshot. So in the past, you've been able to add this removal policy.snapshot onto resources that can't be snapshotted, things that are stateless, that don't really have a snapshot functionality. You could set this in your constructs, but it wouldn't really cause an error or a warning or a problem. Well, now there is a new feature flag that you can enable. It's detailed within the PR that if you enable that onto your CDK app, it'll now tell you if you're using a snapshot removal policy on a resource that doesn't support it. Very useful if you want to go back and clean up. So I recommend if you have been using snapshot removal policies, go ahead and enable this feature flag, run a synth, and see if you were maybe putting it on something that didn't actually support it, and then go ahead and clean that up accordingly. EKS now properly passes through some cluster logging properties into the Fargate cluster creation process. In the CloudWatch events, if you set the event source name, it wasn't properly working if you set it to properties on other objects and resources that were being passed around via tokens. So now that's fixed up. In IAM, the conditions in the federated principal, they weren't optional and they were issues. And now those things are properly optional conditionals. Lambda is officially deprecating the 3.6 runtime. So if you're using that in any of your constructs, if you're using that in any of your stacks and things like that, you'll now see that proper deprecation notice on that property, on that runtime. And finally, on the service catalog, the product stack history wasn't accepting nested directories properly, so that's now been fixed up. Moving on to the AppSync module, when you were using a Lambda authorizer with your AppSync code, the Lambda permissions weren't being properly set up, so that's now fixed over there. On the Integ runner, there is a new class now. Let's actually dig into this a little bit. So if you're using the Integ runner, and I recommend that you do, it's a pretty nice little tool if you can afford it into your pipelines. There is this new Integ test construct, which you should be using for all of your creations. And this does show you some details about how to use it. So refer back to that documentation and see what's going on there if you're using that Integ runner. All right, and finally, there was that .1 point release, patch release here. There was an issue when initializing TypeScript projects using CDK and init, where that template and that code was not working correctly. So if you're using the CDK and init for creating TypeScript projects, make sure your CLI is on the 2.28.1 version. All right, so that's it for this week's release. Pretty minor one, no huge crazy new features or bug fixes in there, but just again, good at keeping up good pace about once a week for all their releases, so we always appreciate that. If you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up. It helps me understand if these videos are useful to you. If not, then please leave me a comment and let me know what I could be doing differently, because I am trying to create these for the community. And if they're not useful, then I'd like to know how to make them useful. And finally, if you want to see more of my videos and want to be notified when I release more videos, hit that subscribe button. I've been doing some videos lately on a new project called the CDK Lightbox, which I'm going to be producing more and more videos about to try to get community support and effort around the development of it. And there's going to also working on a new series of videos related to the CDK and third-party constructs. So if that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button to be notified when they come out. Thank you as always, and I will see you next time.